Yeah, so I'm watching this quote from David Falk saying he really likes LeBron, but he thinks if Jordan had cherry-picked what teams he wanted to be on that had two other superstars, he would have won 15 championships. That's bullshit. You know, look, LeBron's biggest sin was, one, getting drafted by Cleveland, and Cleveland using him as a cash cow, right? Because let's face it, when he went to the finals the first time and faced San Antonio, that was probably the worst roster I've ever seen a championship go to outside of one player, right? The whole rest of the roster was trash, you know, and I don't say that maliciously. I say that relatively speaking, relative to other championship teams that have gone to the finals, the rest of that roster was trash. I mean, even Allen Iverson had Dikembe Mutombo, arguably the best defensive center in the league, on his team. Those Cleveland Cavaliers had nothing, and LeBron took them to the finals. That was sin number one. Sin number two, LeBron was too damn good to have his team go all the way down to the bottom. You see, usually when a team gets the first pick in the draft, the rookie that comes in, one, is not in a winning situation, and two, is not good enough to get that team out of the lottery again, right? So usually, you know, your number one pick, like LeBron was, you go to a terrible team like the Cleveland Cavaliers at the time, and you show promise, but you're not good enough to lift them up out of, you know, whatever bottom-dwelling purgatory they're in. You know what I mean? LeBron lifted them too much. He lifted them too much, and they couldn't add enough. They could not add enough. Furthermore, I don't think it was in Dan Gilbert's interest. I don't think that's what he wanted to do. I think he wanted to get LeBron to just hold on to him and say, you know what? Whether we go to the finals or not, it don't matter. Whether I pay a bunch of players or not, it does not matter. I got the cash cow. Same thing the Lakers did to Kobe in the last couple of years of his life, of his career. They used Kobe as a cash cow, right? Well, you take Chicago with Jordan, right? Chicago gets Jordan. The Bulls suck. First round exit after first round exit after first round exit. He did break his foot, I think, in the first year or something, or maybe it was the second year. I can't remember. Second year, I think. But anyway, they were able to go and get Scottie Pippen because of that, right? I can't remember all the mechanics of it, but I think they were able to go get Scottie Pippen because of that. So they draft Olden Polynice. Chicago does. Chicago drafts Olden Polynice, a player named Olden Polynice. And the Seattle Supersonics draft Scottie Pippen. And Jerry Krause, who doesn't get the credit that he deserves as far as being forward-thinking and trying, forward-thinking, having vision, and trying to win. Give him credit for that. The dude tried to win, right? Whereas, in my opinion, Jeannie Buss and Dan Gilbert just tried to use a name to fill seats and sell merch, right? Dude tried to win. Anyway, Jerry Krause goes and he trades Olden Polynice for Scottie Pippen, right? Then they were also bad enough, the Bulls were also bad enough that they picked up Horace Grant, right? There you go. If LeBron stays in Cleveland, these morons, I'm talking about Mike Wilbon, I'm talking about Stephen A. Smith, I'm talking about, of course, Skip Bayless, right? I'm talking about all the talking heads. If LeBron stays in Cleveland, Dan Gilbert does not get up off his ass to do shit. He sits there, watches the arena be full every freaking game, watches the jerseys fly off the racks, watches the Cleveland merch fly off the racks, and he's happy as a pig in shit. That's the truth. When LeBron went to Miami, it permitted Cleveland to come all the way down, right? Went from the top all the way down to the bottom, right? Now, I'm going to ask you this and be honest. what happened the year after Jordan left the Bulls after the first three-peat? What happened to the Bulls record? They went from 55 wins, right? They lose the greatest player, the quote-unquote greatest player ever in his prime, and go to 53 wins. That's what happened. And I bring that up, and I want you to take this in because it helps form my bigger point about David Falk being full of shit about saying Jordan would have won 15 championships had he cherry-picked his team. I think Jordan could have won 6 championships, maybe only with the Bulls, because of Jerry Krause, because of Phil Jackson, right? But hear me out. LeBron leaves Cleveland after that first title. Cleveland goes from top in the East all the way to the bottom, correct? And they're able to draft Kyrie Irving. Jordan leaves the Bulls in his prime after the first three-peat, and the Bulls go from 55 wins to 53 wins. Explain that. Explain it, right? See, when anybody argues against a narrative nowadays, they're immediately considered a hater, or immediately considered stupid, or immediately told they don't know what they're talking about. Explain that. One player, first to last. First in the Eastern Conference to the number 1 pick in the draft. Another player that's considered the greatest ever by many, maybe most. He's in his prime. His team wins 55 games in the title. The next year, he retires and leaves, and they don't have him. And they go from 55 wins to 53 wins. The math ain't mathing, y'all. The math is not mathing. Right? LeBron left Cleveland because Dan Gilbert wasn't going to get up off his ass and do shit. That's why he left Cleveland. If Dan Gilbert was proactive and LeBron saw he was doing everything he could to bring a championship to Cleveland, I believe LeBron would have stayed in Cleveland. Wasn't the case. So he left. When he left, Cleveland goes from best to worst. He's down there in Miami. He gets a couple titles, right? And when he sees that Dan Gilbert got more to work with now, he comes back. I don't think that people make it seem like it's such a big deal. Yo, people are not putting it in context. They're telling you the acts that happened, which are facts, but they're not telling you the truth. The truth requires context and understanding, right? And when you put it in context, it makes sense. Everything LeBron James did makes sense, you know? And the reason why I spoke of the Bulls going from 55 wins to 53 wins, right, is because, one, I don't think you could lose the greatest player ever in his prime and go from 55 wins to 53 wins. I don't think you could do it. If you got the greatest player ever in his prime, you go from first to worst. Right? If you won 60 wins one year, depending on who you pick up and what happens, you go to 500 record the next year. You do not go from 55 wins to 53 wins to damn near beating the Knicks in the freaking Eastern Conference semifinals. You don't do that. That's what I do know. You don't do that. So that right there tells me that, in my opinion, right, if you needed the hardest evidence you could find, not just two assholes talking about, no, I think Magic is better, no, I think LeBron, no, I think Jordan is, no, those are hard numbers right there. Is that the end all be all of the argument? No. But you better acknowledge them. If you're being fair, real, and honest, you better acknowledge them. Because the Bulls were able to replace Jordan the next year with a guy named Pete Myers. Pete Myers. You ever hear of him? He was a Jordan replacement when Jordan retired after the first three-peat. And the Bulls went from 55 wins to 53 wins. 2 less wins. And you lose the greatest player ever in his prime. Right? The reason why I bring that up is because it speaks to how tight the chemistry was around Jordan. Right? It speaks to the plug and play nature that you could use on the Bulls and still keep that machine going, right? Of course you're going to be better with a Jordan as opposed to with a Pete Myers. Of course, right? My point was that the system did so much for those Bulls, right? And it was such a part of their championships, almost, I'd say, unlike any other system I'd seen. You know, like, you could say, okay, the 80s Lakers, the Showtime Lakers had a system. Now, not like those Bulls did. That triangle, the way people spoke about the triangle, was like a living entity that had to be combated on the court too. You know? And that's the interesting thing about those Bulls. And there are a lot of moving aspects around that team that don't really get acknowledged. So, the notion David Falk thinks that Jordan could have won 15 titles, I don't think so. As a matter of fact, I think that Jordan is a good shot. He wins no titles anywhere else. Even the use of Scottie Pippen. If you ask me whose team it was, right, after watching the Bulls in the 80s and in the 90s, I'd say it was Scottie Pippen's team. Is Jordan considered the greatest ever? Yes. But I'll tell you what, Scottie Pippen don't get enough credit. He does not get enough credit for what he did. And Horace Grant does not get enough credit for the role he played. You know, I mean, those guys, man, they put in work. And it was a very unique dynamic that had to go around a player like Jordan. Just like I believe is going to be a very unique dynamic that has to go around a player like Luka Doncic. Luka Doncic, in my opinion, right? Doncic and Jordan, two different players. Two very different players. But the way you have to build around them is similar. You know, they're so good and such superstars that you almost can't trade them. You can't trade them. I couldn't imagine Michael Jordan being traded. People don't understand how big he was, you know. But I could imagine Luka being traded. I can't imagine, especially now that he's been traded. But you couldn't imagine Jordan being traded even before the dude won the titles. You know, you couldn't imagine him being traded, right? Well, the team that has to go around those guys has to be, you have to acknowledge chemistry and you have to tweak it, and then once you have the chemistry with the players, you got to bring in the right coach to put it together and make it happen. That's why I keep saying Lakers need to run a triangle offense, the way Luka dominates the ball. Look, I don't mean to get off topic. My point is this conversation they're having, right, in which Jordan is almost implicitly the greatest player ever, which tilts the conversation as it's going on, right? You're having a conversation under the umbrella that Jordan is the greatest ever. So, it's just bullshit. It's bullshit. You know, like I said, if you watch the 80s, you know those Bulls got their ass whooped by many different teams. Did they get over the hump? Yes, they did. They got over the hump. But when they started the championship run, like I said, all the great teams that had whooped their ass had kind of gotten older. Right? And then all the other teams that they commenced to whoop ass on in the 90s were teams that the 80s teams had already beat. Shit, the 90s Lakers beat the Trailblazers that the Bulls beat the next year. You know? So the bigger point is Jordan could have, in my opinion, could have only been as successful as he was on those Bulls teams at that particular time. I don't think he's that successful in the 80s. I don't think he's that successful in the 2000s. I think that the NBA was going through a transition at that point in time. They had new teams. The old guard was getting older, right? And, they weren't as good as they were. The remnants of the West Coast was all that was kind of left. Like Karl Malone and Stockton, the Lakers never looked too seriously at them. In the 80s, they just weren't worried about them. Were they younger? Yeah, but, so, I don't know, man. Sometimes I watch these shows and it's like, you guys are just looking for something to talk about, right? Every time somebody says something versus Jordan versus LeBron, it's like, well, the person was high profile enough who said it, so we got to talk about it. And you won't see me do too many videos like this. I'm only bringing it up because, hey, I lived through it too, right? Except, unlike you, David Falk, or Chris Broussard, or Mike Wilbon, I didn't gain my fame or make my money off of Jordan. He got nothing to do with my life. I owe the dude nothing, right? So if anybody has any allegiances, it ain't me. I'm just telling you what I saw, which is Jordan got his ass whooped for years, right? And when he got Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant and Phil Jackson, that's when things started to change. Whereas LeBron was in Cleveland and Dan Gilbert took arguably, you could argue that from a single player perspective, right? Getting rid of team success, that LeBron was the greatest player in the NBA when he took those Cleveland Cavaliers to the NBA Finals to play San Antonio, and I can't remember what year. You could argue he was the greatest player in the NBA that year, right? Who else was on his team? And all you morons who say, well, isn't it his responsibility to make the team better? You're the same morons who yell a pre-Jordan championship era and a post-Jordan championship era. Because where the hell was Jordan's Bulls? How come his Bulls weren't in the finals until 1991? He was drafted in 1984. What took him so long? Right? You abide by that too? I'm just saying, man, can't be a hypocrite about this shit. Anyway, yeah, that's where I stand on that, man. Really, who gives a shit? They're both great players. What difference does it make? If you have something to talk about, it could be fun every now and again, but who gives a shit? Hey, y'all, Pure Uncut Lakers, please like and subscribe.